I like ska. Ska is actually really relevant to what we're talking about today for a variety of reasons. Right, so a couple of quick things. So I realized that I forgot to reopen last week's vocab quiz for you. So again, because this week was entirely my fault. I've left it open now till Friday night.
Okay.
So if you just get it done by Friday night. Okay. And your annotated bibliography is also due on Friday. You may notice in the pile of papers I left for you, there's a sample annotated bibliography, but I'm pretty sure you've done one of these for me before.
I've done a few of them.
Yeah. So I imagine you know how to do this.
Yeah.
But you've got a model to follow now, and if you have any questions, you can just direct them to someone else, not me. And your final vocab quiz will be Sunday. There are a couple of terms on here that aren't going to end up on any of the quizzes, but we'll go over those on Monday when we talk about Zadie Smith. Yes, and for Monday what we are reading is a short story by Zadie Smith called The Waiter's Wife. Last reading for this class, last reading quiz, and then a week from today we're just going to be doing review for the exam.
Okay.
So that is what the other handouts that I have given you are about, right? So we've got a set of sample essay questions for the final, and also the vocab study sheet. And
the final, it's going to be 2 of the questions or just 1?
Yeah, so it's going to be 2 500-word essays, and then you're going to do 10 IDs. Otherwise, the instructions are the same as the midterm, and the same as every exam you've ever taken with me.
Cool.
Just with different questions. It's always the same format, just different questions. And I'll provide you with a blue book.
Okay.
Okay. Any other questions about anything that's coming up?
Our exam is next Friday?
Next Friday, yep. 10:30, I think, yes. Yeah, week from Friday is our final. Okay, great. So, what do you think of these poems?
I liked them. I mean, in a way that I liked that they were speaking about it. Kind of bringing attention to the fact that I liked the colonization in reverse.
Okay.
That was an interesting concept.
Yeah.
They were colonizing England at that point. It's not surprising, the reaction from England.
Oh, sure.
In terms of everything, just racism and all that. But
yeah. In fact, there's really only kind of a 20-year window in which this kind of mass immigration into Britain is happening, right? So it opens up in 1948. And it is largely shut down in 1968. And the next time we see any kind of large-scale immigration into Britain is kind of in the 90s as EU membership expands. And people from other European countries, particularly in the Eastern Bloc, like the old Eastern Bloc countries like Poland, are sending immigrants to Britain. After 1968, the amount of non-white immigration into Britain is curtailed drastically. We'll talk about why and how this happens in a moment, right? But I think even this, the amount of European immigration into Britain, I think is part of what fueled the Brexit vote of a couple of years ago, right? When the people of the United Kingdom voted narrowly to leave the European Union. So these are issues that are kind of still present and unresolved, right? But I think one thing that we do need to keep in mind is that Britain has for a long time been more cosmopolitan than people realize, and less white than people think it is. So Britain was part of the island of Britain was part of the Roman Empire, right? And we know for a fact that there were North African soldiers stationed up near Hadrian's Wall. Remains have been found of ancient people with sub-Saharan African features, indicating that, yeah, there were Africans in Britain in late antiquity. And we even have a letter written by a black trumpeter who worked for Henry VIII, asking the king for a raise. So even before, you know, the Atlantic Trade Triangle and the Royal Africa Company and the slave trade, right, there are black people and brown people in Britain. And indeed, you know, some families that are there for quite a long time. What's different about this era in the 20th century, right, is that it's coming in the aftermath of two massive world wars in which Britain has suffered pretty serious losses, and it's also coming around the same time that the British Empire is cracking apart, right? So just to give you a little bit of a sense of kind of what the situation is in Britain as this immigration from the colonies is coming in, right? So after World War I, right, we've already kind of discussed the death count, not just from the war itself, but from the flu pandemic that followed it. And then there's another world war in 1939, right? So at the beginning of the war in 1939, the population of Britain and this is all of Britain, right? This isn't just England. This is England, Wales, Scotland, Northern Ireland, and the Isle of Man, is about 48 million people. We'll just write million because I can't remember off the top of my head how many zeros are in a million. Now, during the war, or as a direct result of the war, there are almost 400,000 military deaths. Plus another 70,000 civilian deaths, right? Because the Second World War wasn't fought almost entirely on land in trenches like the First World War was, right? Nobody ever fought a war like that ever again. Instead, in order to terrorize and demoralize the population of Britain, Germany instituted a massive bombing campaign. Right? They were flying planes over Britain and bombing British cities, and about 70,000 people died as a result of these bombings. Now, the other thing that these bombings, now in a population of 48 million, 70,000 doesn't sound like a massive number of deaths, right? It's still a lot of people over 6 years. Yeah. And you know, it's like whenever I think of kind of numbers in this way, right? It's like, well, yeah, but it's like, but you know, like think of, you know, that person's family and friends and connections, right? You know, it's like the loss of one person,
right,
is, you know, to something like this is a disaster. But this bombing campaign also does an enormous amount of damage to infrastructure, right? It probably does more damage to buildings, to roads, to factories, and to morale than it does directly to people. I promise this is related to immigration. So in this period called the Blitz, right? The Luftwaffe flies over major British cities dropping bombs. Most of the cities that they hit are either large population centers or they are industrial centers, right? So like, for example, one of the biggest targets is London. Not a big industrial center, but it's the financial center of much of the Western world. Enormous population center, and it's also the capital of the nation, right? The other two biggest targets were the industrial cities of Birmingham in the Midlands and Liverpool in the Northwest. Liverpool was a big shipbuilding center and a large shipping port. Other targets included Sheffield, noted for steel production, and later on Def Leppard. Manchester, also a big industrial center. Coventry, Southampton, Plymouth, Portsmouth, Bristol. Right, Bristol is primarily a vacation spot. But also a big shipping port. Newcastle, Hull, and just to show that this was not limited to England, Swansea in Wales, Glasgow in Scotland, and Belfast in Northern Ireland, right? So I'm not giving you this list, just like because I want you to memorize all of the cities that were attacked during the Blitz, right?
Right.
I'm giving you this long list to demonstrate how widespread these bombings were. Right? They were hitting all regions of the United Kingdom. They were hitting cities of various size, cities of various levels of economic and cultural importance, right? And cities in each of the different nations of the UK, right? So this was everywhere. And in addition to all of this physical damage that was done to the country, these 400,000 military deaths are also disproportionately from the able-bodied working-age male population, as tends to be the case with military deaths, right? So, what prompts Britain opening its borders to increased immigration in 1948 really is a labor shortage. They've got a lot of rebuilding to do, a lot of jobs that need doing, not just in construction, but people to do various kinds of low-level civil service jobs, bus drivers, for example, subway operators, nurses. They ended up bringing in a lot of nurses from the Caribbean. And so in 1948, Clement Attlee's Labour government passes a bill they call the British Nationality Act. And so what this act does is it grants UK citizenship to all residents of the United Kingdom and its colonies. Right, so if you lived in a British colony prior to 1948, you were not a full British subject with all of the rights and responsibilities pertaining thereto, right? After 1948, if you're born in Jamaica, if you're born in Nigeria, if you're born in India or Pakistan, actually not India or Pakistan anymore because those would by then be independent nations. But yeah, if you're born in Jamaica, you're born in Nigeria, you're born in Kenya, you are now a British subject, a British, with all the rights other British subjects have. And this also grants right of settlement to subjects born in the colonies, right? Essentially what this means, right, is that they now have the rights to come and live and work in Britain, and to avail themselves of British social services, which honestly their tax dollars were already paying to support. And the idea was to encourage working age young men from the colonies to come live and work in Britain. Probably temporarily. And so in 1948, in fact, the date we have for this is 22nd June 1948. A ship called the Empire Windrush docks at Tilbury near London, carrying about 800 young men. From the Caribbean to come and settle in Britain. And initially, the only people who were coming over were young single men. That was the first wave of immigration, right? It wasn't families coming over. It wasn't women and children. It wasn't older people. It was almost exclusively young men who were coming over for jobs. But then almost immediately after this ship first landed, more restrictive laws started being passed on where they could live, on what kind of work they could do, on how much they had to be paid, right? Generally less than a native-born Briton, right? So the kind of citizenship that they were granted was not an equal citizenship. Landlords were permitted to not rent to black or brown tenants. They tended to end up concentrated in particular neighborhoods like Brixton and London. They were often targets of community violence and resentment. And a lot of them did end up on the dole, not because they weren't trying to find work, but because no one would hire them, despite the fact that there is, in fact, a labor shortage on. And that's the reason why this law is passed in the first place. But a lot of this first wave of immigrants actually do end up, they do assimilate to a certain extent. and many of them end up marrying white British women and raising biracial families. Mostly, this is restricted to the working classes. But that Louise Bennett poem you were talking about, Colonization in Reverse. So this is a poem from 1957 that is describing not quite this first wave of immigration, but what's happening in the 1950s, where some of these men are paying to bring their families over. If they've got a wife and kids, say back in Jamaica or Trinidad, they might now be paying, they might have made enough money now in England to bring them over and support them. Their mothers, grandmothers, elderly aunts, things like that are coming over and following, right? So let's look here on page 858 for a minute. What a joyful news, Miss Mattie. I feel like my heart going burst. Jamaica people colonize in England in reverse. By the hundred, by the thousand, from country and from town, by the shipload, by the plane load, Jamaica is England bound. Dem a pour out of Jamaica, everybody future plan is we get a big time job and settle in the motherland. What a island, what a people, man and woman, old and young, just a pack them bag and baggage and turn history upside down. So first off, what do you notice about the language here?
It's not like Britain, white, like language at the time. So
Yeah, this is
like her home, like language.
Yeah, this is not British English. I get like the struggle to think about like what to call this, right?
Yeah.
Because a lot of the things that we used to call things that weren't the Queen's English are now kind of regarded as insensitive.
Yeah.
But this is a good example of a particular like linguistic strategy that a lot of writers from post-colonial nations adopt, right? So there are two basic ways that they go in terms of their relationship to the colonizer's language. The first is called abrogation, and the second is called appropriation. So abrogation is a refusal to write in the colonizer's language. If we're talking about like the Anglophone world here though, right, that doesn't necessarily mean that they're refusing to write in English. Sometimes it does. The great Kenyan novelist Ngugi wa Thiong'o no longer writes in English at all. He writes only in his native language of Kikuyu, which is the more extreme form of abrogation, right? But the lesser form is instead an insistence on writing in one's own English, right? Rather than what you are told is standard proper English. And I didn't ask you to read this, but there's a, on page 856, there is a, the text of a radio broadcast that Louise Bennett did in the late 70s. It's called Jamaica Language, where she talks about the relationship between Jamaican English and British English, and the reasons, the reasons why it angers her that Jamaican English is regarded as, a somehow kind of like lesser thing, right? So if we look at this, there's a listen now. My Auntie Rochi said it had boiled her temper and really vexed her for true. Anytime she heard anybody style we Jamaican dialect as corruption of the English language. For if that be the case, The dem should call English language corruption of Norman, French, and Latin and all the entire language. What dem say that English is derived from. What do we get to wood? Derived. English is a derivation, but Jamaica dialect is corruption. What an unfairity. Anti-Rochi say that if Jamaican dialect is corruption of the English language, then it is also a corruption of the African Twi language too. Aho. So yeah, I think you got the joke here, right? So what's her basic complaint here?
That, I mean, one, they're being hypocritical.
Yeah. What's the difference between a derivation and a corruption, right? It's not as though there is some pure form of English that has existed since the beginning of time, right? English, as spoken in England, has been like you've got this Anglo-Saxon core of the language, but it's been influenced by Latin, it's been influenced by Norman French, and by just about every other language that English has come into contact with, right? And the difference really here is in who speaks it, not in whether one is more pure than the other, right? That's her basic complaint. The other thing that she's doing, does it seem to you as you read this that she is not capable of speaking in or knowledgeable about British English?
I think that she is knowledgeable about it.
Uh-huh.
I wasn't sure if yes was going to that or if no was, because the way the question was worded. So.
Yeah, there are points where she slips into it, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. This, by the way, that's called code switching. When you change your mode of speech to suit the audience you're speaking to. So everybody does this to some extent, right? You don't speak the same way, with your boyfriend that you do with your grandmother, right?
Right.
But for ethnic and racial minorities in a given society, right, there's this expectation that they're going to speak to the dominant powers in society, the dominant groups in society in one way, and then speak another way within their own group, right? So you have to be fluent in the codes of both groups, and you have to be able to switch between them depending on who you're talking to. Now, this is often used as an example of ways in which minority populations get around being disempowered within a society. But one thing that Bennett is doing is using this to kind of push back, right? She's making a joke out of the standard English lines. And, almost like she's putting on a snooty accent, right? To mock the pretensions of people who say that her language isn't as good as British English. And yeah, and you're absolutely right. Bennett was perfectly capable of speaking and writing in British English. She was educated in England. So she makes the choice, this abrogation choice, to not write in British English, but instead to write in Jamaican English. And pretty much only in Jamaican English. But to get back to the poem here, right? So, what did you think was funny or interesting about this poem?
Like this, it kind of seems like a little I want to say backhanded. Subtly, just
yeah.
Haha, now we're calling everything you guys.
Yeah, she does coming to settle in the motherland, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, not just coming for a visit, right? No, coming to settle, to stay, right?
Yeah.
And I think like there's a particular bit at the end here that I kind of want to focus on, because I think in some ways this is the most vicious part of the joke. On page 859. For when them catch a England and start play them different role, some will settle down to work and some will settle for the dole. Jane say the dole is not too bad because they paying she £2 a week for seek a job that suit her dignity. Me say Jane will never find work at the rate how she doth look, for all day she stay upon Aunt Fan couch and read love story book. So, on the one hand, right, this looks like a depiction of a lazy Jamaican sponging off of the system, right? But think about it in terms of the idea of colonization. Who is this really satirizing?
England. Because they're paying. Were they doing unemployment at that?
Oh yeah. You could, if you were a British subject with full rights, then yeah, you could apply for unemployment. But yeah, the joke is on England here. But remember about this in terms of like the idea of colonization, right? If you think back to those, say, Caribbean sugar plantations of the 18th century, who was doing all the work there? It wasn't the English plantation owner, right?
Yeah, no, it was the people who lived there.
Yeah, so this is a kind of reversal of that, right? That Jane is behaving like these, English ladies who came to the Caribbean used to, right?
Uh-huh.
It's like, yeah, like, we're going to come and live off of you for a little while, like you used to live off of us. So yeah, it's a joke about these women of the plantation who would just sit around reading Gothic novels and romance books all day, and do no real work.
Yeah. It's funny.
Yeah. Now, the other linguistic strategy here is called appropriation. And usually when we see this word, we usually see it in the context of people from the dominant culture taking things from minority cultures, right? Like, when, suddenly, every white suburban kid in the 90s was into hip hop and was like wearing Adidas and backward baseball caps, right? When we talk about this in terms of language and colonialism, though, what we're actually talking about is a writer adapting the dominant language to express the minority culture's values. And the Kamal Braithwaite poem is actually a good example of this. And again, like before we look at that poem, in fact, I actually want us to listen to that poem. I've got it queued up here in a minute. I'll play it in a minute. But I want to look at his essay briefly on nation language. On page 863, he starts talking here about education in colonial society, right? says, in the Caribbean, as in South Africa, and in any area of cultural imperialism for that matter, the educational system did not recognize the presence of these various languages. What our educational system did was to recognize and maintain the language of the conquistador, the language of the planter, the language of the official, the language of the Anglican preacher. It insisted that not only would English be spoken in the Anglophone Caribbean, but that the educational system would carry the contours of an English heritage. Hence, as Dennis said, Shakespeare, George Eliot, Jane Austen, British literature and literary forms, the models that were intimate to Great Britain that had very little to do, really, with the environment and the reality of the Caribbean, were dominant in the Caribbean educational system. People were first forced to learn things that had no relevance to themselves. Paradoxically, in the Caribbean, as in many other cultural disaster areas, the people educated in this system came to know more even today about English kings and queens than they do about our own national heroes, our own slave rebels, the people who helped to build and to destroy our society. We are more excited by English literary models, by the concept of, say, Sherwood Forest and Robin Hood, than we are by Nanny of the Maroons, a name some of us didn't even know until a few years ago. And in terms of what we write, our perceptual models, we are more conscious in terms of sensibility of the falling of snow, for instance. The models are all there for the falling of snow, than of the force of the hurricanes that take place every year. In other words, we haven't got the syllables, the syllabic intelligence to describe the hurricane, which is our own experience, whereas we can describe the imported alien experience of the snowfall. It is that kind of situation we are in. So is Braithwaite just talking about content of language here when he's complaining that their education in English doesn't speak to their experience? Is he just talking about the content of that education, or the content of what's related in language?
No, I don't think so. I mean, in terms of content related to that, like to that language, what do you mean?
Well, so it's, for example, the fact they're taught Shakespeare rather than any kind of, native Caribbean writer.
Right.
Or that they know more about English history than they do about their own, yeah. I think I want to focus on these words he uses, syllabic intelligence. Because what he's talking about here is the rhythms of language, right? And he describes British English as being well suited to describing things like the falling of snow, because it has that kind of natural iambic rhythm, right? That kind of gentle da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. So even like the rhythms of the language itself are not suited to expressing the more violent weather that he's used to growing up in the Caribbean, right? As he said, like our experience isn't snow, our experience is the hurricane. But given British English as our tool of expression, right, we have a hard time putting that into words, where it's easier to put this alien experience of snowfall or fucking daffodils, right? Like, this is like anyone you will ever meet or hear give a speech who has been educated in a British colonial system will probably complain about daffodils and about having to read all these Wordsworth poems about daffodils and no one bothering to explain to them what the fuck a daffodil is. And why Wordsworth cares so much about them. So I'm gonna play for you a recording of Braithwaite reading his poem Calypso. And I want you to pay more attention to the rhythm of the words than to the words themselves, right? So how is he kind of like finding a way out of this iambic, heartbeat, gentle snowfall rhythm?
The stone had skated out and bloomed into islands, Cuba and San Domingo, Jamaica, Puerto Rico, Grenada, Guadeloupe, Bonaire. Curved stone hissed into reef, wave teeth fined into clay, white splash flashed into spray, Bathsheba, Montego Bay, bloom of the arcing summers. The islands rolled into green plantations ruled by silver sugar cane. Sweat and profit, cutlass profit, islands ruled by sugar cane. And of course it was a wonderful time, profitable, hospitable, well worth your time, when captains carried receipts for rices, letters, spices, wigs, opera glasses, swaggering asses, debtors, spices, pigs. Oh, it was a wonderful time, an elegant, benevolent, redolent time. And young Mrs. P's quick, irrelevant crime at 4 o'clock in the morning. But what of Black Sam with the big splayed toes and the shoe-black shiny skin? He carries bucketfuls of water, 'cause his ma's just had another daughter. And what of John with a European name who went to school and dreamt of fame? His boss one day called him a fool, and the boss hadn't even been to school. Steel drum, hit the hot calypso dancing, hot rum, who going stop this bacchanaling? For we glance the banjo, dance the limbo, grow our crops by maljo, have loose morals, gather corals, father or neighbors' quarrels. Perhaps when they come with their cameras and straw hats, sacred pink tourist from the frozen north, we should get down to those white beaches, where if we don't wear breeches, it becomes an island dance. Some people doing well, while others are catching hell. Oh, the boss gave our Johnny the sack, though we beg him please, please to take him back. So the boy now migrating overseas.
I listened to that in my house.
Oh, you did?
Yeah.
Cool. So what do you think of what do you think of like the way Brathwaite reads his own poem here? What do you notice about it?
Well, I think for one, he knows the rhythm of it, like the rhythm in which he thought it, spoke it in his head.
Yeah.
So hearing it out loud kind of makes you have like a whole different kind of like, it slows it down, it speeds it up in places.
And there is a rhythm to it, right?
Yeah, but there's also not, it's not consistent, which I think makes it even more like, I don't want to say original, but like original to him at least.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I know that like we have a very boring, like, narrow, just like rhythm speaking.
Yeah.
I mean, unless like I can go on and ramble and start talking and never shut up, but like this is like the rhythm is very much his.
Yeah, and I think like part of what's going on is there's a dance rhythm here.
Yeah.
Like
it definitely feels like a song.
It's not so much that it's irregular as that it's kind of shuffling, right?
Yeah.
It's not like that kind of like that usual, kind of European music 4/4 time beat.
Right.
And I mean, he does call the poem calypso, which I think here has kind of a double meaning, right? Like, one, it's that it's a type of Caribbean folk music. And so I think he wants us to read the poem and to hear the poem in that kind of folk music rhythm, right?
Right.
But calypso is also, I don't know if you've read the Odyssey or parts of it, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Do you remember who Calypso is?
Wasn't Calypso it was a lady on an island, right?
Yes.
She was,
yeah, a woman on an island, yeah.
Kept the men there.
Well, by the time Odysseus gets to Calypso and her island, he's the only one left.
Right.
I think you're confusing her with Circe.
Yes.
Circe's the one who turns the men into pigs.
Yes.
Calypso
kind of like just doesn't she like keep him kind of like not like a trance, but like she wants.
Yeah. She basically like keeps him as her love slave.
Right.
For about a decade. Yeah. So there's also like in the name Calypso, there's this sense of like the kind of like temptation of an island, right? And an island that won't let you go. Like an island is a kind of prison. And I think we kind of really get a sense of that kind of like in section 2, which is like I think that the part of the poem that when he reads it sounds most like a conventional English language poem, right? Because he's reading it from the perspective of like a conventional British-centric history, right? You know, the islands roared into green plantations ruled by silver sugarcane, sweat and profit, cutlass profit, islands ruled by sugarcane. And of course it was a wonderful time, a profitable, hospitable, well worth your time, when captains carried receipts for rices, letters, spigs, spices, wigs, opera glasses, swaggering asses, debtors, vices, pigs, right? Now, what we have here is like, white nostalgia for a slave society, right? And Mrs. P's quick, irrelevant crime at 4 o'clock in the morning, can you guess what that would be?
Yeah.
Yeah, sleeping with the houseboy, right? Yeah, exactly. So, it's a situation in which the colonists get to have their way with the slave population in basically every way, right? And then we move back into, like in section 4 in particular, back into that calypso dance rhythm, right? As we're getting, more from the perspective of, the people of these islands themselves. But I do want to talk about just kind of 2 more things here. So we noted, right, that non-white immigration into Britain kind of dries up after 1968. And there are 2 things that happened in 1968. One is that a law has passed specifically limiting immigration. But one of the impetuses for this law is public sentiment as expressed by a member of Parliament for the Conservative Party by the name of Enoch Powell. And on April 20th, 1968, Powell gives a speech that has come to be known as the Rivers of Blood speech. It's called the Rivers of Blood speech because of a quote that he takes from Virgil's Aeneid, showing off his classical education. incidentally, April 20th also happens to be Adolf Hitler's birthday. So maybe coincidence here, maybe not. But Powell, in his speech, rails against non-white immigrants and kind of raises a defense of white Britons who have been called racist for, say, for discriminating against non-white immigrants. And it's very much like it almost sounds like, I don't want to get too deeply into contemporary American politics here, but the language is different and a little bit more polished and urbane, but the content is very much like a Tucker Carlson rant. Like where he's talking about, in particular, this threat of white Britons being replaced, right? So he makes a kind of little rhetorical trick at one point, a little bit of rhetorical sleight of hand. He argues that by the year 2000, 1 in 10 people in Britain will be non-white, which actually turned out to be more or less correct. But if we look at just even like the number, like kind of 1 in 10 here, right? If we express 1 in, I know this isn't a math class. I know that one of the reasons we major in English is because math isn't our thing. But express as a percentage, right? What is 1 in 10? 10%. 10%, yes. And percent means out of how many? So what does the word percent mean? 10% equals 10 out of how many?
10 out of 100?
Yes. So what sounds like, so we're talking about the same number here, right? It's the same ratio. But what sounds like more? 1 in 10 people or 10 out of 100 people?
1 in 10.
Yeah, because it's closer to you, right? It's a smaller group, so that one person stands out more than the 10 do in the crowd of 100, right? So he's using this little statistical sleight of hand here to make it sound like more than it really is. Yeah, yeah. Not notwithstanding the fact that Powell thinks this is a problem, right? That there are going to be more non-white people in Britain, even though 90% of the country is still going to be white. And in fact, today about 87% of the country is still white. Like the United Kingdom is still overwhelmingly white. But yeah, he's kind of like raising this threat in order to get the government to pass measures to limit immigration, right? And to be fair to the Conservative Party of the 60s and 70s, they basically disavow Enoch Powell and strip him of committee assignments and make him into a backbencher and say, he's not really our guy.
I can't believe he was saying this in 1960. Just like the years for me, like now that I'm like older and I can fathom that was the year before my parents were born. Like yeah, it's crazy.
Yeah, and I mean
and that was not long ago at all.
Yeah, and you've got your 1968 is. I think it's the 1968 is the year Martin Luther King is assassinated as well. Actually, just a few days before this speech.
Yeah, when I went
like 2 weeks before this speech, Martin Luther King is assassinated.
When I went to Washington D.C. and like dates of everything were like right there for you to see.
Yeah.
Because I haven't taken like a history class in high school, so
yeah.
in high school I wasn't thinking about it like that either. I was just trying to pass. Like now.
Well, I think college is where we're encouraging you to make these kinds of connections
Yeah,
between
which is good,
between the
right?
classes you're taking. Yeah,
But
yeah.
it is crazy to me, like the timeline.
Yeah, I mean this is all within living memory.
Yeah.
I mean, you
And
know,
then our kids are gonna look back, and my kid, your kid, you're soon. Have fun. No, I'm kidding.
Yeah, I mean,
But like, that's crazy that they're gonna look at our time, and I'm like, I don't want them to look at our generation the way we looked at the generations before us. But I have a feeling they're gonna be like, oh my gosh, that happened, and I'm like,
yeah.
2023.
Okay, millennial, yeah. Okay, Gen Z.
Oh my gosh, that's horrible.
Yeah.
Guy sucks. There's also 420.
Yes. that
Not
is,
that has any relevance.
no. Certainly no relevance to Enoch Powell. I don't know. Maybe that could have mellowed him out a little bit.
Yeah.
But yeah. So, and Powell's vision of Britain, and this is probably going to become a little bit more relevant as we talk about the Zadie Smith story next time, right? But Powell's vision of Britain becomes pretty powerfully influential, and particularly in a lot of working class mixed neighborhoods. You start seeing things like this. Right, people painting things like, keep Britain white.
I saw I think it was in the book.
Yeah.
One of the pages there was, I think it was when the Masonry language, one of the first pictures on there. It was a picture of like a protest or something. I think. Maybe I could have sworn somewhere I saw a picture.
Okay, yeah. If we look on the page 884.
Oh,
Yeah. There's this guy. This is the 1959. Yeah. So this is something that starts fairly early. But I think you may have noticed in the Grace Nichols poem and the Linton Kwesi Johnson poem, which are both written in the 1980s, a kind of darker and more pessimistic tone, right? So let's look at the Grace Nichols poem first on page 882. The fat black woman goes shopping. Right. Shopping in London winter is a real drag for the fat black woman, going from store to store in search of accommodating clothes and to weather so cold. Look at the frozen thin mannequins, fixing her with grin, and to pretty-faced salesgirls exchanging slimming glances, thinking she don't notice. Lord is aggravating. Nothing soft and bright and billowing, to flow like breezy sunlight when she walking. The fat black woman curses in Swahili, Yoruba, and nation language under her breathing, all this journeying and journeying. The fat black woman could only conclude that when it comes to fashion, the choice is lean, nothing much beyond size 14. So what's going on here? What is this poem really a complaint about?
That there was no accommodating winter clothes for plus size women.
Yeah, she's coming from a place where she probably doesn't need winter clothes at all, right? But yeah, I think that the idea that there are no clothes to accommodate her, right, is indicative of a bigger problem, right? Who are all of the clothes designed to accommodate, right? To what standard are they designed? To what standard of beauty? Or whose standard of beauty?
I guess probably white women than like white women.
Yeah.
And that's like a totally different style too. Sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, well, these are clothes that are too small and too tight, right? They're designed for thin people in a cold country, not for larger people in a warm country. Nothing billowing and breezy, right? And so I think like it's so that on the surface the poem is about clothes, but it's really about the difficulty of cultural assimilation, right? When the standards that you are asked to assimilate to were designed with people other than you in mind, right? People, she talks about the pretty faced sales girls, right? Whispering behind her back and thinking she doesn't hear. But what that's indicative of is like the way, people will make fun of you or denigrate you for not meeting whatever the standard is. But they won't adjust the standard to make it more inclusive, right? It's already set up to benefit them. So I know this has been a really kind of fun and cheery afternoon thus far. With Enoch Powell and cultural assimilation and appropriation and all that kind of fun stuff. But I think like this is probably a decent place to stop it. Do you have any questions about anything for me before I let you go?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't think so.
And just in general, thanks for being so good about being basically the only one here.
I kind of like it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's like you're doing an independent study.
Yeah.
Okay, so it seems that I must have had a brain fart at some point and didn't actually put these A.D. Smith reading questions on my little thumb drive here. So I will email those to you this afternoon.
All right.
And yeah, just remember, there will be like last reading quiz will be Monday.
Okay, cool.
All right. So we'll see you then. Have a good weekend.